Hey everyone, welcome back to your favorite go-to-market podcast. I'm your host, Ross Rich, and today we have a very special guest. We have Keith Jones, head of go-to-market systems at OpenAI. You might have heard of their product or used it recently. But yeah, thanks so much for taking the time and really excited to get your perspective on just generally how revenue leaders and teams can leverage this kind of growing systems team in the RevOps world. So thanks so much for making the time.
Yeah, of course, Ross. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, before we dive into, kind of the strategies and tactics and all the details, would be great to hear a bit about yourself and your journey into this role and exciting opportunity you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my journey can be characterized somewhat summarily by two themes. The first is that I got a random opportunity way longer ago than I care to cite by naming the actual year to do sales operations before I even knew what it was. I was hired in my early 20s to do shipping forecasting for a medical device company in Excel. I ended up doing a lot of other things, building out sales processes, helping optimize the sales support function there, and a number of other things. But funny enough, I ended up going into a sales role at that company only to find my way out of that company later on and into growth stage tech when I found my first AE job at a very small data enrichment, data service, data as a service type startup. I was employee number 8. I was an AE there. And that was where someone first gave me the keys to Salesforce because they recognized two things about me, Ross. The first was that I was terrible at cold calling. I've never been good at it and never had a place for it, which is why I have immense respect for outbound sales reps. Second was that I was pretty good with the product. Like I was technically inclined. I'll never pretend to be a developer. That's not my territory. I'll never pretend to have that expertise, but I am a tinkerer. I like gadgets. I like technology. And so I got a chance to explore how to use Salesforce for was really the second time in my career, but first time with the keys.
Yeah.
And that kind of grew from there into a career that spanned, sales ops, marketing ops, a little bit of more solution engineering, and ultimately found my home many years ago as a go-to-market systems leader.
Very cool. I love how organic that is. And honestly, I feel like follows a similar path of just how great it is to be at a startup early in your career and to be able to follow what kind of energizes you and that you can contribute the most to the business in that because there's so much to do, right? It's like, hey, I'm not as good at this thing as other folks we could bring on, but I'm excellent here, and that's where I'm going to spend my time. And that's not, I don't think, how 90% of businesses run typically,
Yep.
unfortunately. So,
Unfortunately not.
but yeah, shifting gears and I think also before actually we move on with your background, I feel like I've had the most resonance and connection and impact working with systems and operations folks who have done the job. And I find it takes a rare person to have the empathy and understanding how to build systems for people who haven't sat in that seat at least a little bit. So I think that's a very common theme that I've seen from some of the best operators in the kind of like RevOps world.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to agree with that. I mean, there's sort of two different ways of looking at the world, right? The first group, the more operationally, maybe revenue minded, even revenue obsessed, customer facing role, right? It's all about how do I do more, right? Whereas in the technology systems side of the world, I feel like it's not necessarily that we're trying to do less. It's just that we know we can only do so much so quickly, right? Because our work is methodical, it is nuanced, and that's just the reality of what we do.
Totally.
It's definitely changing a little bit, if not a lot, thanks to things like what OpenAI is doing. So we're actively evolving as a discipline, but the methodicalness does not go away, unfortunately.
Totally. Totally. Well, to kick things off in kind of a particular order, we're going to talk about a few strategies today to drive execution excellence in this world. That's we're going to get enlightened into how you think about systems in revenue. But first is being a good partner to your system team. I think I've struggled to figure this out both first as a seller and then as a sales leader and now as a CEO because we don't really have your perspective. So that I think would be really good for our audience. That's a large portion are revenue leaders and sales leaders. So how do you think about being a good partner? And again, we talked about empathy, understanding their side of the world, and how do you help share your problem statements, not just solutions with the team to come up with better answers together.
Yeah, I could spend a lot of time on this particular topic, and I want to say at the top of this answer that I am and my team are definitely the benefactors of wonderful partners who are just partners based on the fact that they are open-minded, that they ask open questions, they don't try to be arbiters of our capacity, our bandwidth, or how we go about doing something. It's definitely a partnership at the most base levels right away because of who they are and how they operate. So there's a lot of just generic things that can be applied there,
Yeah.
but metering into a little bit more specificity of how it has worked really well for us, I'd say that there are essentially three core tenets that I think that really benefit a very productive partnership between, say, a revenue org and a go-to-market systems team, or even the operational side of the revenue org. And those are that you need to allow, first and foremost, time and some process to how systems does things, because the work needs to be so methodical. We do need to test things. We do need to be sure that before we start building the thing that we understand what we're actually trying to achieve, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of figuring it out as we go. And given the nature of technical work, that's not always the most productive way to tackle that, right? So I'd say first and foremost, you just need to allow some process. Now, this can get really tricky because there's definitely a slippery slope to too much process or process for the sake of itself.
Yeah.
So that's been one of the particular challenges that I'm happy to say that I think we've solved for here at OpenAI while we've been just cranking and scaling so quickly, is that we've accepted just the right amount of process as we go, where we know and can see it brings immediate benefit, but not where it ventures into that process for the sake of itself.
Actually, I want to just interrupt you there because I'm
Yeah.
realizing, even partly myself, but also, folks out there might not understand fully the difference between the system side of things and the traditional maybe RevOps side of things. So I'm curious, maybe just so you can help, define that for myself, and maybe other folks out there thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit high level of how things have worked for me now at two different orgs, which have
Yeah.
largely been the same. That I think is really a really key and clear example. So we tend to work most directly with our operational counterparts. That's not to say we don't value the input of our sales leaders and success leaders. It's just that they serve as a very useful filter in terms of the priorities and the needs of that business. So instead of me trying to have a conversation with 15 different sales leaders, I'm having a conversation with 3 people in field operations, giving me really clear, concise insight into what can systems tackle next that's
Yeah.
going to yield the most impact or generate the most materiality for the business, right? So that's kind of the yin and yang, is that you've got the ops people working on the actual, like, because there's a lot of process and a lot of sales plays and things that can run and or be designed end to end that don't require any work from us,
Yeah.
right? But that's where they come in and where they serve a really key part of that partnership, is they then are smart enough, savvy enough to distill that down to, okay, this is where we actually need systems. And we need systems to change something or to build something new for us. And so most of our roadmap comes from that group. That's how it's worked now in a couple of different orgs that I've worked in, and it's been great.
And when you think about that partnership between ops and sales, do you think about your end customer as still the sellers, or do you think about that as the ops team?
I think of what I will often refer to as the field. So
Yes.
that being, the account directors, the solutions engineers. I think of them as our end customer
Yeah.
ultimately. And the way that I try to frame it is that, anything we do that benefits them hopefully has tangential benefit to the customers externally that they
Yes.
serve, right? So I think of them as our end customer. I think as go-to-market systems and operations as two core teams that help meet those customer needs. But it's definitely a partnership between us in pursuit of serving the customer that is the go-to-market field staff.
Okay, no, that's super helpful. Yeah, just before you get into the details, even for me, I think because RevOps and systems has been evolving so quickly,
Yeah.
even the last couple of years, let alone the last 5 or 10, it can mean different things at different organizations for sure.
For sure, and it definitely gets almost sometimes a little too muddled, right? They think of them as the same thing when they're really not. They work really well together, but that doesn't mean that they're done exactly the same way, if that makes
Totally.
any sense.
Totally.
But yeah, I think there's a couple other things that work really well. I mean, the first and the other things that come to mind are like like I mentioned, I alluded a little bit earlier to like there's testing and there's refinement and really a lot of work that we have to do before we click that button that makes something go live, right? It's a
Yeah.
lot more than just clicking a button, just to be clear. But we need to take that time to do that and to make sure that every step in that process is working. And there's really, truthfully, candidly, only so much or so fast you can do that type of work, right? So allowing the time and space for that is a really key component to being a good partner to your systems team, in my professional opinion. But I'd also say that, often enough, these tools and technologies that tend to fall into the remit of someone like myself and the team that I have the privilege of leading, they have very wide audiences, much wider than the, maybe let's call it core go-to-market that tends to be the ones really using them all day, every day, right? Because there's a lot of data and insights and everything else created within these systems and these tools and these applications. And so it's like, give us space to like understand and drive alignment, because the one thing that is really counterproductive to high quality systems work is shifting priorities every day or multiple times a day. When you go ask us to build this thing, we can't build it in an afternoon, because we've got to figure out, okay, how are we going to build it? Then we actually have to go build it. Then we have to test it. Then we have to figure out how do we get it live, right? There's a lot of steps in that process. And so if we're not having the space to figure that out, or we're not aligned in the very beginning, then we're just going to end up going over and over again, starting, stopping, and never really getting anything good done.
Yeah, it feels more like kind of the classic example of like a builder's schedule or calendar than the go-to-market side. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, we can't just come out of, starting to architect something and then hear some feedback, go back to it. You really need to go deep in those things and have, more of a kind of product building mindset and schedule and priorities than being able to shift around as much as, some other roles and jobs.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've been in situations before, both technically and in other lines of work, where you can truly get really amazing things done in a small amount of time. And I had a previous manager in a different org tell me, he's like, listen, something will only take as much time as you allow for it to take. And there's some virtue to that, but also there's still a series of steps to follow and to make sure that we get done correctly. So there is a limit to just how much you can compress that timeline and expect a quality outcome at the other end of it.
Completely. Well, any kind of final advice you would have for sales leaders out there that might, or RevOps folks out there that might have never partnered closely with system teams, to leave us with before we shift gears to more of the tech side of things?
I think just, maybe this is a little repetitive, but I would just say, like, have an open mind to what's going to work best for both sides, right? Like, go to your system team and be like, how do you like to work? Like, what's going to make you most effective? Because I promise you, every systems team worth working with wants to build a lot of really cool things on behalf of the organization they work for. But they want to do it in a way that they know that they're not going to have to constantly fix it or constantly tweak it and iterate on it just because it was built quickly or haphazardly. So ask your team, just be like, hey, how do you like to work? Like, what can we do that's going to make you more efficient, more productive, and more successful in your work? Because if you find that out and strike that balance, you're going to be off to a really great start.
Awesome. Well, shifting gears to, I think a thing that people struggle with a lot around, especially at tech companies, is buying and using technology. So I'm curious, as a systems leader, how you think about that process and how to partner really closely with the right folks internally, to go through the evaluation, validation, onboarding, adoption kind of long-term journey to make the most of these investments. Because from my perspective, it's not actually the kind of software license fees that end up taking the most resources out of this. It's everything around it, the cross-functional teams, the time we're taking out of the core job to implement these tools. So I'm curious how you've thought about making the most of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we could probably do a whole series on like the whole life cycle, right? The evaluation, the negotiation, the actual implementation, and then the adoption and enablement. So for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on like the front end of the equation,
Cool.
which is the actual buying process, right? And you might want to keep count of how many times I'm going to say the word AI in the next couple of minutes, because it's going to happen a lot. But that's only because I've been buying technology now for well over a decade. And in that time, I've done it a lot of different ways, some great, some not so great. And it's thanks to, honestly, the advent of the technology that OpenAI has introduced the world to that I think I've finally cracked the code on how to do this in a really good, effective, and efficient manner. So there's kind of three parts to this. The first has to do with driving alignment and synthesizing your requirements. The second is ensuring that everyone has access to all the same information in an easy to serve manner. And then finally, driving consensus around what you learn about the vendors you're evaluating in line with those requirements that you captured earlier. So to run those through in order with a little bit more detail, and interrupt me at any point, Ross, if you want to dig in deeper, if you hear anything interesting. But on the synthesizing or collecting of requirements, we've done something I think is pretty cool that's easily replicatable to anyone who has access to ChatGPT. What we do at OpenAI that I'm really proud of is that we put everyone involved in the evaluation of a new type of software through a very brief exercise. It's intentionally brief, where we ask them to do two things. One, fill out a doc with a little bit of a brain dump. Like, what are your 5 must-haves and what are your up to 10 nice-to-haves about this technology, right? Yep. Now, that's templated and it's in a nice little format, grammatical errors aside or whatever else. It's like we've got some serialized data around what you want out of this particular technology, right? But that's only one piece of the puzzle.
And where do you go? Sorry, just to jump in there. Like, who are the people that you're collecting this from? Because what I find a lot of the times on both the buying and the selling side is we don't always get the input from the right stakeholders from the very jump, and a lot of this stuff will come in the middle and the end, which I think can be very frustrating to the person internally PMing it, being like, "But I thought we had this." And same thing with the the partner who's trying to be a very supportive partner. It can be very frustrating, I think, for both of those folks driving it forward if we don't collect not just the right information, but from the right stakeholders. And missing one or two folks can kind of like, drag down the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, not to, invoke like tried and true methods and, say there's something like truly novel or new about this, but I think it just comes to, maybe something as basic as a RACI early on, right? Like,
yes.
You just need to know, like, who is going to be accountable for this? Who is going to contribute to the success of this? Who just maybe needs to know about this, right? If we're talking about the different roles that are mapped out in a RACI. But the reality is you gotta draw out all those points and just be like, okay, we know now, at least at a high level, the groups or personas of people that fit within maybe a basic RACI. Mm-hmm. So let's make sure we have at least one person representing each of those so that we can weigh them accordingly. That would be my answer to that.
Totally. No, that's super helpful. And I think a lot of times when sellers are afraid of asking that question, when I think it can actually help uncover for the project owner maybe a reminder, someone that could be missing, and suggesting those, hey, we've done this 100 times, here are the usual people. Oh, shit, that's actually helpful for me to be like, oh, we might have not gotten that. Let me check with them, or let me check with someone to make sure, so I don't end up finding out 10 weeks from now that we're missing a key requirement for them, or they're upset because their input wasn't gathered early on.
Yeah, and I would say also, like, there's probably virtue in casting a little bit of a wider net initially, because then what could ultimately happen throughout that discovery process or any further steps of the evaluation is people might drop off, right? They might come to the determination that maybe they don't need to be as involved, or they don't have as much of a vested interest, or have other priorities, and that's okay. But if you cast a wider net first and then allow, even however organically, for people or groups to drop off for all the right reasons, you're going to be in much better shape versus the example that you shared where you're trying to bring someone in last minute that completely refactors the whole thing.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, so we start with broad, standardized way of collecting and synthesizing the needs to have and the nice to have.
Yep, but here's the really cool part that I didn't get to. So you can ask someone to fill out a doc, but you're getting a version of their input, right? I want something a little bit more raw, a little bit more instinctive, if you will. And so the next step that I ask everyone in our buying groups to do is I say, okay, take that doc, open up a screen recorder, and narrate it for me for 5 minutes. Because what's ultimately going to happen is you are going to either add context and or correct something that you put on, because you yourself are now going to edit yourself and or add that context. And this is where the AI comes in. And I can't believe this is the first time I'm saying it in this bit, but here it is. I take that doc, I take the transcript of that recording, I give it to chat, and I say, hey, go ahead and synthesize these things together. But then I do that for every individual within the group. And I give chat a little bit of detail around what persona each person fits and how many personas I have, so that it can codify everything within those personas. And ultimately what I end up with first is a list of synthesized requirements by persona that have been sourced from a series of individuals within each persona. But then I take it one step further, because this is obviously something that a human can do if you give them enough time, but something like chat can do it infinitely faster, is I say, okay, there's probably overlap in all these requirements. Not everyone is a unique snowflake. Sorry, that's just not the case. We all have our own distinctive needs for our respective functions, roles, titles, whatever. But the reality is there's going to be some overlap there. So chat, now that you have X number of requirements per persona for Y personas, I want Z. Go ahead and tell me what the more concise, overlapped, consolidated list of requirements is. Because what I have now is I have a rubric by persona. And I can demonstrate back to each person in that persona of how we've captured their requirements. We can score every vendor against those requirements, but then we can aggregate those scores within the more consolidated set of requirements, which makes for a really clear, objective decision around where we should spend more time as we get further into that evaluation.
And is that a collaborative process with the potential vendors, or is this pre any engagement? This is like the internal stuff first.
Yeah, so I think it's really ultimately up, kind of dealer's choice and how you decide to go about it and what your style is for, or what your business's policies, procedures, or anything else is for how you interact with vendors. The way I personally decided I prefer to do it is it's mostly internal, right? But there's also, this is again just where I believe that there's value in this. Part of our buying process is that we go through the first round of demos, right? Where we intentionally, and we don't, we're not trying to gatekeep, but we do tell the vendors this. We're not going to tell you anything. And that's because we want to see from you what you consider to be an ideal deployment of your software or your technology with no premise, no pre-information, because chances are you're going to challenge some of our assumptions.
Is this your 80-90% use case, or are you just going to sync the pitch to what you're hearing, and it might not be that, and it might not be your usual perspective? I love that. Yeah,
because there's no way to remove 100% of the bias, right? We're all human, so that's going to happen. But you do create space to challenge that bias and or move the goalpost a little bit if it indeed does need to be moved.
Cool.
Yeah. But one other aspect of this that I think is really cool is how we further use our technology is that as we're having these conversations and watching these demos, and of course in 2025, we're recording these because not everyone's physically in the same room. We're all over the world. And so we have clear, concise recordings and transcripts of this. We have endless amounts of documentation and other collateral that the vendor will provide throughout the process. And we just load that all into a purpose-built GPT for that evaluation and say, look, if you couldn't make the demo, it's going to be recorded, it's going to be transcribed, analyzed by your conversational intelligence vendor of choice, or just through a simple meeting function or recording functionality of your VC tool. But we're going to give that recording and that transcript to the GPT so that you can go back and say, hey, did the vendor talk about X, Y, or Z at any point, or did we ask about A, B, or C? And the GPT can come back and say, actually, Ross, yeah, that did get covered in the call with vendor X. And by the way, here in the call is where that took place. So now you can go back and look at that recording and reference a particular point where your question was addressed, and you can listen to the raw take on that.
Interesting. I wonder, obviously, for the folks that are early adopters to this, they're going to lean in and understand that. I'm just thinking about the cultural change for other stakeholders to engage in that way versus wanting to hear it directly. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think it ultimately depends on how you pitch it,
yes.
right? So we all know that that first meeting or that first sales pitch, it's our first impressions, last, right? And I would say that like if you're pitching as like a hey, we don't want you to have direct input or we don't want you to hear it firsthand, then of course you're going to get resistance because anyone who's told not to do something just suddenly wants to do that thing. That's human nature.
Yeah.
But the way I tend to pitch it, I've found success with is look, I know you're busy. I know you have other things going on. I know that the buying of this particular category of tool may not even crack the top 5 or top 10 of your priorities.
Yeah.
But it is one of my top 5. And I can't make a confident buying decision without your input.
I love that.
I'm designing a process that maximizes for asynchronous information gathering and synthesis so that if you have a conflict, if you can't make that demo or it's frankly impossible to schedule a demo for
you're
12,
not going to slow
15,
it down.
Right? Let's not slow down the process, but let's make it so that you can still get access to that information and understand what you need to know of those vendors in order to help inform the overall decision.
Well, you clearly were in sales, Keith, because that's a good, stakeholder-friendly positioning for that. Yeah.
Everyone's always surprised when I present really well or I have like these skills because they think I'm just some technologist hiding in the corner, cracking away on the keyboard. And I'm like, no, listen, I did get my start somewhere else where I learned some of this stuff. So,
Which everything is sales at the end of the day. But so the last part before we transition to one of the topics I'm actually most excited to get your take on, which is balancing, this type of work for finance/ops or for the customer is then driving consensus. So let's say we've done an amazing job at the right criteria, synthesizing the right knowledge share with all the right stakeholders. Now, how do we, I think the hardest part is a classic expression of like, it's hard enough to, pick a meal with your wife or your family, let alone make a B2B business decision that's going to impact a lot of folks. How do you use AI in your process to support a confident final consensus-based decision?
Yeah, so what I love about introducing AI to this piece is that it kind of becomes this obviously non-human, but like third-party, more objective partner to the whole process, right? So the final step for me in the process is, at this point we've had a series of meetings, we've generated, thanks to chat, a really handy rubric by which we've now added our human input to around how we think these vendors represent this, right? But there are two other pieces to the equation that help. First is the vendor needs to score themselves. I didn't mention that earlier. So we do want the vendor to score themselves so that we can compare and contrast where, for example, let's say someone in one persona gave a vendor a low score, but the vendor gave themselves a high score, or even vice versa, right? Obviously, the vendors are going to be biased for themselves and try to score, themselves relatively favorably. But if there's a huge delta, that means we should spend more time there because either the vendor is misrepresented or missed the mark or maybe not understood the problem well enough, or we didn't listen well enough or misinterpreted something.
Yes.
One of those things is true.
Yeah.
So let's find out. And so that's the second piece. But then the third piece is like, okay, we have our human inputs, we have our vendor inputs. Why don't we now ask the AI to do what we did in the inputs based on all the data, intelligence, meetings, transcripts it has access to, and let it give some scores, right?
Interesting. And
now we can further take that step and say, okay, where does this robot think that we're off, right? Keith Jones rated vendor XYZ with, 4, 4, 4, and 3. The vendor gave themselves all 4s. Okay, that's understandable. But then the AI was like, actually, I think that it's a 2 here, a 3 here, and a 1 here. Cool. Okay, now let's dig in a little bit deeper and make sure we check that box before we make a decision.
Interesting. And is that taking into account like the broader team's input and the initial, like how would you architect that to make sure that you're capturing all that information in the final AI score?
Well, so I'd say like that's all being built around that rubric, which was only built with that initial intake, right?
Got it.
I do think, though, you help me understand one thing, which I think is very important here, which is you need to say that over and over and over again throughout the process. Because it's all too easy for the buying group to forget that they're the ones that helped curate the list of requirements originally, right? And you can ask, especially as most of the world has seen how our models have gotten more and more capable of reasoning, and not only reasoning but explaining their reasoning, is that you can ask it to say like, hey, why did you synthesize this way, right? And so it can give you some of the context behind its decisions.
Interesting. Like, why did you score this a 4 here? Yeah. Why is this a 3 here? Why is this a 1 here? That's interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, and they may point you to that, hey, well, the way they answered this question, and well, maybe that was like our misunderstanding or their misunderstanding of like, oh no, that actually changes, the way that we would see this answer. Well, I could talk about this all day, like
Yes.
you said, but I want to make sure we hit
Let's do it.
this last bit here. Is again, the third piece is balancing the system team, quote unquote, work for more of the finance or ops side versus the customers, both as the field team as well as your end customer. So curious to hear your take on how you think about balancing both of those kind of key stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two aspects to this. The first is a little bit more, maybe a little less sexy and a little bit just more programmatic in nature, right? But it's just you gotta allow for a certain division of your time to be allocated in different places, right? Something we're doing now is that we're reserving a certain percentage of our bandwidth on a regular basis for what we're just going to refer to as like quality of life improvements, right? The little small easy wins that maybe aren't the big infrastructure level swings that you want to take as a technology team or a systems team, but the things that make the day of the individual AD just because you got rid of that field or cleaned up some things in Salesforce so that it's just a little bit less messy, a little bit less friction for them, right? So that's the first piece. Is just know that you need to divide your time. You can decide for yourself, your business, with your stakeholders, your team, what that division looks like, but you should consider like, okay, we'll spend 80% of our time on infrastructure, 20% of our time on quality of life, right?
I love that because those projects are really hard to prioritize in the middle of. They're not going to be a top big one because they're small little incremental things that add up. And
Yeah, and I think one of the things that like is really easy to forget that I love that I get reminded on a regular basis is that I have a job because this go-to-market team exists, right? So if at the end of the day, if I'm not applying some of my bandwidth to making their lives easier, making their work more efficient, more productive, then I've missed the mark entirely, right? I do have a responsibility to the business to build infrastructure and to make these big swings, but I've got to balance the trade to some degree, right? So I think that's the first part of it, which is just like decide that you're going to divide your time up and decide what that division looks like. But then from there is a slightly more methodical approach that I think benefits both parties. And that is that you need to take a look at, essentially all of the data that you are either capturing and or creating in your systems, in your go-to-market tech stack. And you need to do the first piece, which is understand which parts of this data, what data points, fields, information, whatever have you, are critical for running the business. What data, if it's wrong or missing, is going to be the really awkward point in the board meeting, right? So you've got to come up with that delineation because the reality is not every data point is as critical. There are some things that you're capturing because they're nice to haves or...
That's where my mind's going to. It's just we have so much. Are we really using this stuff or is it distracting to the core thing? So, that makes a lot of sense.
So the way I like to phrase it is like figure out what data points you are running the business on, right? What in certain conversations, however high level, right? And I'm using the board as an example because it's as high as it gets, right? What data points are being shared and discussed there where decisions are going to get made that have significant impact downstream, right? So figure out that, and that doesn't mean that that's all you should have. You're always going to have some of those nice to haves or lesser impactful data points that are still useful for like tactical decision making or coaching or things like that, right? Mm-hmm. But understand the delineation there. The reality is, though, even once you subset that group, because this is the next piece, you're still going to have a long list of data points, right? We've all seen those 50, 60, 70 slide board decks, right? The reality is, especially high-tech businesses, there's a lot of information, a lot of data, so that list is still going to be long. So now you need to take the next step, which is you got to stack rank those. So which one is going to, again, using that analogy or example of if this data is either missing or inaccurate, and results in a really poor conversation, like what's the one that's going to cause the most severe reaction, right? Which one's going to cause anaphylactic shock versus which one's just going to cause, a little itchiness, right? That's what you've got to figure out. Because once you have that stack rank, then you can approach mindfully and methodically the final piece, which is, okay, of this, let's work our way down from worst all the way down to least of how do we maybe automate the capturing of this data point? Mm-hmm. And I want to really strike here that because, like, yes, there's a lens of that where it's like, okay, we don't want the human or the AD or the SM or CSM or anyone like that. We don't want them doing it because, they're fallible as all humans are. But think about it through more of an emphatic approach of like you're removing the burden. You're making it so that
Yes.
they can just
Not they're
focus
going to get
on
it
what.
wrong,
Yeah,
but
it like
yeah.
and they are going to get it wrong. Same way I'm going to get it wrong when I do my sprint management in Asana later today, right? But the reality is that like we're all fallible, but like let's think about how we can reduce the administrative burden on all of us collectively, so that we can make sure to create a more accurate system of record, if you will. So I
Totally.
think that's a really key piece there.
Totally. Well, I got a million notes here that I've taken. Hopefully other folks that are out there, listening have learned a few things. And just, again, this is such a different world that I think about every day. But that impacts, obviously, the revenue organization and leadership. Just a quick recap here. We started out talking about the other side of the table, right? I think sometimes sales leaders can get really frustrated by like, why don't we have all this stuff? Or why are we asking us to do this more, more fields, whatever, but like understanding from the systems team why they're doing it, and trying to be a good partner there to actually accelerate the things for your job is a great place to start. We talked a bit about a great use case of AI that I haven't even thought a lot about, which is the buying and consensus building around just decisions in general. I think this is a good example, buying technology, but you could be using for a lot of other big decisions at the company. And then, how do you think about how to avoid the classic challenge of we're collecting everything, and which really is distracting to the point of data, which is to make decisions. And if it's overwhelming, you can't use any of it, right?
Yep.
So super informative, Keith. And thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day to share this with us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Glad to share it.